Please.
I think one of the issues, Linda, that the court had several arguments on was whether the constitutional principles of a free and fair election should be interpreted primarily through the Elections Act or through the lens of the Constitution itself. And I think what the court is saying is that the principles for conducting an election under the Constitution in Article 81 and 86, that is free, fair, transparent, accountable, verifiable, were not met in the just concluded general elections.
Okay, so we can move on to the second issue that the judges are looking at. So this is issue number one that they focused on. They also said that the first respondent, that the IEBC failed, neglected to conduct election in accordance with the law. Martin, what do you make of this?
Indeed, that's what Charles has just explained, that because there is a legal provision which flows from the Constitution, expecting that the IEBC will conduct a free and fair election. What the court has said is that they failed, or indeed they neglected, to conduct themselves that way. And there are several reasons that they could give, only that they have said they've reserved that for the full ruling.
They'll give us that later.
Quickly, there are a number of issues here. Did they adhere to the law in terms of the transmission? Did they adhere to the law in terms of fidelity, in terms of faithfulness to the requirement of ensuring integrity of Form 34A, and then 34B, and then 34C? And indeed, the whole case was around such a messy, such a murky handling of 34A and 34B. And that's what the courts have just affirmed.
Okay, allow me to speculate a little bit. Do you think the back and forth about access, read-only access, and what played out in court could have had a hand in this?
Essentially, what the court concluded, the court-supervised inspection of the IEBC system concluded that they did not cooperate. Now, why were they refusing to cooperate? Certainly, if they had opened up this system, perhaps we would have seen more of a can of worms than expected, because essentially there were forms there that had not been stamped, there are forms there that had not been signed, there are forms there that had no marks, there are forms there that had serial numbers, there are some forms that had security marks, some did not. I mean, certainly there was a problem.
Okay, let me look at the second issue now. So this is the verdict on the first issue. Could we look at the second issue, whether there were irregularities in the conduct of the 2017 presidential election? Kanjama, in terms of irregularities, what did you pick from this?
I think what the court basically said is that the cumulative effect of the various irregularities, some of which were demonstrated in court when the reports from the scrutiny and the access involving the forms and involving the electronic systems were presented to the court. The cumulative effect of those irregularities was such that the court was not confident that the election was verifiable, transparent, and accountable, and therefore that would nullify the election result. So the court departed from the current wording of Section 83 of the Elections Act and the current interpretation from the 2013 case that you must show how those irregularities affected the result.
They've often moved away from what happened in 2013.
And indeed, what may actually happen out of this, if I butt in, is that we must find that Section 83 of the Elections Act is actually unconstitutional. And that's the essence of it. So looking at it and comparing it as to whether it flows from the Constitution, you find that it is a woolly requirement that should actually be expunged.
Okay, let's look at the verdict on that second issue. So the courts are satisfied that first respondent, that is the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, committed irregularities in the transmission of results. And as we, now that we are here, it would be interesting to ask this question to both of you, and I'll begin with you, Kanjama. So in the next 60 days, Kenya goes back to the election, but then there are several leaders, we just heard from some of the NASA leaders saying, yes, we may be going back to an election, but they don't necessarily trust the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. So how essentially does this play out? Who gets to oversee this election in 60 days? What are the options?
Linda, this is an area where there is a major constitutional conundrum. And that conundrum rises from Article 134 of the Constitution of Kenya. Kenyans need to realize that President Uhuru Kenyatta is president by virtue of what is called temporary incumbency.
Okay,
Under
hold on. I need you to explain temporary,
incumbency.
So, wait, hold on, I need to release my viewers on KTN Home. Thank you so much for watching this coverage of the Supreme Court, of course, the presidential petition. Our viewers on KTN Home, have a good afternoon. There we go. So to our viewers on KTN News, welcome back. Kanjama, you're saying temporary what?
Temporary incumbency. Temporary incumbency means you have a president who had been duly elected in a previous election. You have since had a fresh presidential election. The outcome is not yet determined. So during the period from the fresh presidential election until you have a duly sworn-in president, the previous president exercises what are called temporary incumbency powers. In other words, he's an incumbent. He's in office by virtue of being an incumbent, but not by virtue of having won the fresh election. So that is incumbency, and it's temporary. It's the period between the date of the elections, which happened on 8th of August, until the date when the next president will be sworn in.
Okay, this temporary incumbency, does he have all the powers he used to have? What is there anything that changes?
Yes, and Linda, that's what I wanted to explain. Under Article 134 of the Constitution, during the period of incumbency, the president has limited powers.
Okay.
And the essence of the limitation on his powers is that he cannot appoint state or public officers that is required to appoint under the Constitution or the law. So he cannot terminate, he can't appoint, and he cannot fire. He cannot fire his cabinet secretaries. He can't appoint a new cabinet secretary. He cannot fire a judge. He can't appoint a judge. And therefore, it seems that he cannot appoint or fire IBC commissioners. So that raises a conundrum. What happens if IBC commissioners, for example, were to resign?
Linda,
Martin.
I just want to differ a little bit with my colleague.
Go ahead.
Article 142 states out the term of office of the president. It says the president's term starts from the date he is sworn in until the time the next president is sworn in. The elections that were held have been nullified. There's no swearing in that have happened. There is no temporary incumbency to speak of. It is 142, the term is solid, the president is in office, and he'll act until the next president is sworn in. That's
So
the law.
he's still the president with his
Still the
powers,
president.
according
Full
to you.
powers. With full powers. With full
Okay,
powers.
so we're still on IEBC. Kanjama, are you in agreement? The president is still the president with full powers?
No, I think there's been a misinterpretation by my colleague. I'll just ask him to look at
I can read it for you straight.
Article 134.
Yeah.
134 is the one that deals with incumbency.
But you see,
Okay,
we
we
are
need to come
talking
to an agreement
about...
because I need my viewers to understand
Yes,
what's
what
going
we are
on.
talking about is this.
Yes.
What is the term of office of the president? And Article 142.1 says, the president shall hold office for a term beginning on the date on which the president was sworn in and ending when the person next elected president, in accordance with Article 136.2a, is sworn in.
But Martin, I have a question. Has he handed over the instruments of power?
Not yet, no.
So essentially he's still the president?
He's still the president.
Okay, Kanjama?
Article 134, paragraph 1 of the Constitution states, a person who holds the office of president or who is authorized in terms of the Constitution in exercise of the powers of the president during the period commencing on the date of the first vote, on the date of the first vote in a presidential election and ending when the newly elected president assumes office, may not exercise the powers of the president specified in clause 2. So the first vote was on 8th of August. So from 8th of August until whichever date a new president assumes office, this is just the express reading of Article 134, the president is exercising powers of incumbency. In fact, this was a case from 8th of August. Even after that vote has been nullified, it remains still the first vote. So during the period of incumbency, he cannot start, for example, appointing new judges to the Supreme Court, to other courts. And the reason, the philosophical reason behind this is that he is in office as the president, but he doesn't have the full mandate of the people, because the full mandate should have been bestowed in the general elections that should have been held on 8th of
so you guys are
August.
agreeing to disagree.
Yes, and that you don't read one article on its own, you should read it also in as read together with the other articles.
Okay.
Now, but we can leave that for another time. Basically, we have a president in place.
You guys have agreed to disagree.
Life should continue.
Okay, can we look at the third issue, please? Okay. So the judge is also saying there's no evidence of misconduct on the third respondent, that is President Uhuru Kenyatta. All right, so the issue number 3 was, if there were irregularities, what was their impact on the integrity of election? Because essentially there could be irregularities, but maybe they didn't have that much of an impact on the integrity of the election. Kanjama?
No, Linda, just before you leave, the first point really is an important point. Because remember that one of the issues that was being raised about the third respondent, which is the president-elect, was that he might have also committed electoral offenses. The court is saying they do not find any such evidence, and therefore they absolve him.
Yeah, we'll go back to that.
Yeah, so I think that's a very critical point for us to underline. But then Kanjama can come on to this.
Yeah, so the question was whether there were irregularities.
And if they were, what was
and
the
if there were, what was their impact? And I think this was the issue we were discussing before, that indeed the court found there were irregularities, and that their cumulative impact was to render the election null and void. In other words, the court is not certain that the outcome that was declared was a genuine outcome because of the cumulative effect of the irregularities and their impact on the constitutional standard of free, fair, transparent, accountable, credible. Okay. Verifiable.
Okay, so let's move to the next board, if we may. There we go. So the verdict, the court satisfied that there were irregularities, and that is why they have nullified the win of Uhuru Kenyatta. So Kenyans are now going back to the ballot in 60 days. So you have millions of Kenyans watching you, and they need to understand. So what happens from here now, Kanjama? Where do we go? All right, yes. So the courts have given their verdict, so where do we go?
And I think, Linda, that's very important, because there are 3 things that will be taking place. The first will be a review of the electoral ecosystem and the architecture, which includes, of course, the Electoral and Boundaries Commission. What went wrong? We need to get the full decision of the Supreme Court in a big hurry, because that is what will guide IBC, that is what will guide all the political players on what needs to be put in place to ensure that the next election passes the constitutional test. So that's the first issue that will need to be happening. The second issue that will happen concurrently is that you will find that several other politicians will start testing also the other elections that took place with the presidential election. You'll find cases in court. You'll find challenges in court to various aspects of the last elections to prepare for fresh elections. And thirdly, I think you'll find that we begin again a very hectic period of political campaign.
Exactly, and that's the question. So essentially, when do the campaigns begin?
But before we even do that, what I was saying is that some of the issues that my colleague is talking about are long-term and may not happen within 60 days. Unfortunately, again, it's the architecture of our constitution. It says the next elections must be held in 60 days. Now, the problems with this is this, that the court has just found that the IBC, the umpire of this election, was incompetent, was engaged in irregularities. And you've heard the petitioner saying that we cannot go to elections with these same guys. So we are actually thrown in a kind of a wilderness in terms of our constitutional architecture, because we do not anticipate this. When you say 60 days, you don't have time to begin to mount an electoral process, at the same time address issues of the review and issues of efficacy of this entity. So really we have a discussion here that must be held. Maybe the first thing that should really happen is the closing, the bringing together of the various parties and saying, look here, we have an election to run in 60 days. What are the minimum things that we must talk about? And an inclusive process that begins to even have a common discussion around some of the challenges that have been identified. Of course, obviously, even IBC itself must be demoralized as they sit. Much as they may have tried their best, they are also being told that they also left their defense so open that anybody and everybody was able to enter into this system and interfere with it. Now, with that kind of confidence, low morale, lack of confidence, you really do not expect this body to be up and running over the next 60 days. Yet the Constitution expects that they should organize, and we must have another election in 2 months.
So what are the options, Martin? You have 60 days, and like you said, these guys must be demoralized. So
I've said that there must be a way in which some reasonable processes are engaged, and this is where now you have the government or the president pulling in and talking to his opponents and saying, look, we have a situation, we need to run an election over the next, can we agree on a few minimum things? Can we invoke Article 10 of the Constitution?
What does Article 10 say?
It's about participation. It's about our values of inclusivity, our values of integrity, and so on. So basically what it means is that anytime we have a challenge, there is nothing wrong in us coming together, sitting and finding solutions together. We can't agree on IBC. What do we do together to find a solution, even if it means outsourcing it? As some of them have already said, we might want to look at least some other help that we can be gotten from wherever.
And so that is the concern. And that is the concern, Kanjama. So assuming we get to a point where people decide, okay, we don't trust IBC, we cannot work with IBC, what are the options? The United Nations?
I think, Linda...
And what would that say about Kenya? You know, someone would look at us as a failed state by the time you get the United Nations to help you conduct your elections.
Yes, I think, Linda, the outcome of today's Supreme Court decision is really a proof that our institutions and our architecture in the constitution of our institutions is working. In fact, it is the greatest proof that the Supreme Court has been able to overturn a presidential election decision of the IBC.
Okay.
And it was overturned on the basis of failure to fully comply with the Constitution. The result of that decision cannot be a move to overturn other constitutional principles, but instead to see how they can be implemented in full. In the same way that it was the Supreme Court only that had the right which they exercised to overturn the verdict of IBC, the Constitution gives IBC only the right to conduct the election. This does not mean that IBC has to be constituted as currently constituted. This does not mean that the processes have to go as they went this time, because indeed there were some challenges. What I'm saying is that even if IBC brings in the political players, as they should, to enhance transparency, accountability, to revisit some of the decisions they made that the court has had a problem with, the ultimate body under the Constitution to conduct the election would be IBC. Having said that, it is extremely important that when the Supreme Court judges eventually give us their verdict, and it is extremely urgent now because they need to do it within probably 1 to 2 weeks, they need to give guidance to the country. How will we go about the process of having a fresh election? Because they are the ones who've identified what were the weaknesses. They should be the ones to tell us how those weaknesses should be resolved and which institutional mechanisms should be triggered or applied in dealing with them.
Okay, it's true that you say the Constitution gives the sole mandate of carrying out this election to IEBC. But like we said, you have NASA leaders saying they don't trust the IEBC. You've had a Kuro court saying it doesn't trust the IEBC. So if you get to a point where leaders cannot agree, as Martin says, you get people on a table and you can't agree on whether or not you want to use the IEBC, what other avenues are there, Martin?
I mean, that's what I'm saying, that Article 10, which my colleague is not referring to, simply tells us that we are a people who who must consult, who must bring ourselves together. Whether you have vested the entire mandate in the IEBC, it's again a political process, sometimes a legal process that actually changes IEBC. And there might even be need for us to change the constitution. Remember that in Agenda 4, in order for us to implement the national dialogue, we went in for minimum reforms. So that doesn't take away. The very constitution has also elements to it that says how you can reform it or how you can amend it. So there might be need for us to discuss.
So quickly, before I cross over to my colleague Chris Tairu, because I need Kenyans to understand this, there have been talk of engaging the United Nations. Kanjama, is that even an option?
You see, the United Nations or any other stakeholder of the international community can play a role in an electoral process. Like in the past process, they came in as observers, they can provide guidance, technical assistance, and so on. You cannot exclude altogether. What I'm talking about is, once they have given that assistance, whatever it is that they are meant to do, the body that eventually has to carry out the elections, employ the employ the clerks, the presiding officers, declare the verdict and all that, is the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. Whether the staff are the same, whether the commissioners are the same or different, is a different question.
So they can offer help, but still the body that has to do this is IEBC.
Exactly.
Okay, Fuchs, now we're in agreement. So let me speak to my colleague Chris Tairu, who's in Kiambu. Tairu, can you hear me? Chris Tairu?
Good afternoon to you.
Afternoon, Tairu. What sort of reaction?
Yes, I can hear you, Linda.
Boo.
Well, Linda, I'm in Riru, to be precise. That is Kiambu County. Remember that Kiambu County is the home county of President Uhuru Kenyatta. And the activities are ongoing compared to the other places that we've seen in Kisumu, the celebrations ongoing. Here in Kiambu County, it's a little bit calm. People are ongoing with their daily activities, but they are not really happy with the results. And I have a few residents here. I'll just sample some of their comments. Habari yako, labda tuambie jinsi ambavyo wametoa hiyo verdict. Maoni yako ni yapi?
Maoni yangu sijafurahia hata kidogo. Juu hiyo nchi imerudi nyuma kabisa. Sasa watu wameanza kufanya kazi, tena tumerudi nyuma. Siasa imerudi mahali tulikuwa tumesahau. Hatujafurahi hata kidogo, lakini naambia wananchi wawe watulivu. Tugojee tu uamuzi wa Mungu. Laudi nyingine tutawapiga double.
Uko tayari kwenda katika uchaguzi mara nyingine ya pili?
Hata kitambulisho iko hapa.
Okay. Tupate labda maoni ya mama, tueleze kwa majina yako alafu tueleze hisia zako ni zipi kuhusiana na uamuzi ambao umetolewa.
Kwa majina yangu naitwa Sofia. Nilikuwa nagojea uamuzi sana.